So we recognize that most people on the webinar have a pretty good understanding of the current mechanism for drug coverage, but we wanted to go over it briefly and talk about both the legislative and constitutional underpinnings. So when we talk about the new legislation, we can better put it into context. So I'll talk about the legislation that's in place and the various agencies and where they get their authority. We start with federal, and by federal, we mean Ottawa, Government of Canada. We have Health Canada, which is responsible for approval of drugs for sale, for marketing and sale in Canada. That's done under the Food and Drugs Act and associated regulations. We also have federal drug programs, the NIHB, Corrections Canada, Canadian Forces, that cover, so there are 3 public plans. And that's basically it, because the Constitution gives authority over healthcare to the provinces, with a narrow exception for marine hospitals, which I think is sort of dated at this point, but probably relevant in 1867. Before we move on, let's talk about one other piece of federal legislation, and that's the Canada Health Act. So generally speaking, this only addresses hospital services, physician services, and dental services, and doesn't extend into the coverage of drugs. This was brought up, the Pharmacare Act, as we'll talk about in a moment, is now at second reading, and this was talked about on Tuesday, and brought up the fact that Canada Health Act is missing Pharmacare, and it's probably a product of when it was drafted. So it was drafted at a time when healthcare was primarily delivered by doctors and a little bit less about medications, in particular prescription medications. So I just said that the federal government has limited ability to legislate in the area of healthcare. So how do they have the authority to enact the Canada Health Act? And this is done through their spending power. So the majority of taxes go to the feds. So they have the bigger purse, and what they do is they make transfer payments to the provinces to support healthcare programs. So this is how the Canada Health Act works. It basically provides a list of conditions that have to be met in order for provinces to receive their full transfer payments. And if they don't do that, then their funding is at risk. So we as lawyers actually get a lot of clients who are worried about what they're doing is violating the Canada Health Act. So private actors can't really violate the Canada Health Act. The question is whether they're violating provincial legislation put in place to keep the provinces on side of Canada Health Act so they get their transfer payments. Moving on to the provinces, they have direct responsibility for healthcare funding. So in addition to the federal programs that I mentioned, the provinces are responsible for managing the public funding of pharmaceuticals. So in addition to those 3 federal programs, all provinces and most territories independently manage their own list of covered drugs. And I'm going to talk about this a bit on the next slide as well. But not only do they differ in which drugs they cover, because we have 13 different formularies, they also differ in who they cover. So for example, in Ontario, it's mostly individuals over 65, low-income individuals, or individuals who have high drug costs relative to their incomes. And compare that with Quebec, BC, they might have slightly more expansive coverage. It varies a little bit from province to province. The third group is what we're calling the Pan-Canadian group. And these are national organizations that receive their power from the provinces, not from the federal government directly. So CADTH, and I'm oversimplifying here, but CADTH essentially conducts reviews of drugs to make recommendations to the public plans to either list with conditions or not to list the drugs. PCPA, Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. Historically, there was a bit of inequality between the provinces. For example, Ontario, large province versus PEI, small province. So Ontario was getting better deals on their drugs. So the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance is basically all of the provinces banding together to equalize that negotiation power. On the innovative drug side, their role is to negotiate the key terms for listing agreements on behalf of all theory, or in practice, most of the public plans, and enter into a letter of intent that forms the basis for provincial listing. And on the generic side, they negotiated with the Generic Trade Association, and they sort of set max generic prices. So the process for reimbursement. As I mentioned before, the first step is to get approval to be marketed in Canada. We didn't talk about the PMPRB, but there's a federal ability to set prices. Constitutionality is being challenged but upheld, restricted to patented medications only. And then we get into the reimbursement side. So one thing we're missing from this chart is actually cash pay. So in Canada, for those of you who aren't Canadian, who might not be familiar, there is an ability, if something is not covered by one of these plans, you can still pay out of pocket. So a lot of like sort of cosmetic lifestyle drugs, erectile dysfunction meds, stuff like that will almost exclusively be paid for cash, although sometimes covered by public plans. So two different methods of reimbursement, public and private. Again, this might be news for some of the non-Canadians on the call. From a public perspective, the first step is a review by CADTH for most of Canada, INESSS for Quebec. This is a sort of pharmacoeconomic evaluation, and they'll come out with a recommendation of list, which happens rarely, if ever. List with conditions, so list it, but only in this prescribed circumstances, or do not list. Next, it goes on to the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, where an LOI will be negotiated. The main thing being negotiated is the non-public rebate. So this rebate doesn't actually affect the sort of day-to-day, the supply chain, sort of sale from manufacturer to wholesaler to pharmacist to patient. What it does is at the end of the day, like quarterly, or depends on the province, for every unit of drug reimbursed, the provinces will get a rebate. So they'll get a percentage of that drug cost back. And then that LOI is taken to each of the provinces where you negotiate, and do air quotes, negotiate a listing agreement. Most provinces, there is zero ability to actually negotiate. All the negotiations takes place at the letter of intent stage. And then you're stuck with the province's standard terms. In some provinces, there's a little bit of wiggle room. And then it gets listed, and publicly covered patients can go to the pharmacy, buy their drug, and be reimbursed for it. Usually that happens through the pharmacy system, but sometimes the patient will pay out of pocket and be reimbursed. Private covers individuals not covered by the public plan, and some patients who are, like it might cover their copay deductibles or drugs that aren't covered. And increasingly, we're seeing product listing agreements as well with private plans. They maintain their own list of drugs that are covered, and then cash picks up anything else.
Okay, so the first thing we need to talk about as we transition to our discussion about the Act is this Canadian Drug Agency. The Canadian government, the feds, announced last year the creation of this agency last December, was introduced as the next step in improving the pharmaceutical system in Canada, with the intended effect of providing the dedicated leadership and coordination needed to make Canada's drug system more sustainable and better prepared for the future. So the idea, as we understand it, is that the Canadian Drug Agency will incorporate and build on CADTH's existing mandated functions. We're still going to have health technology assessments. We're still going to have post-market safety and effectiveness monitoring. And there's a few new work streams that are being proposed, including those that are aimed at improving appropriate prescribing and use of medications, increasing pan-Canadian data collection and expanding access to data, and reducing drug system duplication and lack of coordination. The feds have told us that they intend to work with CADTH and the provinces and territories to develop the CDA, the Canadian Drug Agency, and that leads us to the Pharmacare Act. So this act was introduced and went through first reading on February 29th of this year. Second reading began on Tuesday of this week. Our friends from Global Public Affairs are going to walk us through how the act came to be, where it currently sits, and where it's likely to go from here. They're also going to talk about the impact of this week's 2024 federal budget on the act. But first, I'm just going to walk through the act in all its current glory to set the stage for the rest of our discussion this morning. First thing, what do we mean by pharmacare? So the act defines pharmacare as a program that provides coverage of prescription drugs and related products. Section 3 of the act describes its purpose. So it says the purpose of this act is, as set out on the screen, to guide efforts to improve accessibility and affordability, with the goal of continuing to work towards implementation of universal pharmacare, to support the development of a national formulary, and to provide for the development of a national bulk purchasing strategy. Also interesting to note at a high level, the link between the purposes of this Pharmacare Act and the principles of the Canada Health Act. So they are both aligned in terms of what the intention of this federal legislation is, which makes sense. Similar to the Canada Health Act, which Ian talked about, the Pharmacare Act proposes conditions under which the provinces and territories can get payment from the feds for medical services. And as we discussed constitutionally, this is the only way that feds can really wade into healthcare. So with that in mind, we're going to turn to the meat, albeit limited meat, of the Act. So there's three sort of primary meaty provisions that we're going to talk about. One is provisions relating to funding and payments. Two is the development of the national formulary. And third is the development of the national bulk purchasing strategy. So with respect to funding and payments, a couple of things to know. First, in the Act, the feds commit to maintaining long-term funding for the provinces and territories and Indigenous people to improve accessibility and affordability of pharmaceutical products. The Act specifies that this commitment to long-term funding is to begin with funding for rare diseases. Rare diseases is not defined in the Act, and rare diseases are not otherwise mentioned in the Act. We're going to come back to this in our roundtable. Second, the Act provides that funding for the provinces and territories must be provided primarily through agreements with the feds. These agreements are super important, front and center to this whole scheme. But as a result, but there's no discussion in the Act about what these agreements need to look like or what they need to contain, with a limited exception, which I'll talk about. So as a result, we have tons of uncertainty here. When we look at payments, the Act provides that where the feds and a province or territory have entered into an agreement, again, undefined, other than in this case to note that these agreements have to provide for first dollar coverage. So when there's an agreement in place, the feds can make payments to the province or territory to increase existing public pharmacare coverage for specific prescription drugs and related products that are intended for contraception and the treatment of diabetes. This provision has got a ton of attention. Notably, no other disease states are mentioned, and notably, these are not rare diseases. So we're going to come back and talk about this too. Interestingly, too, on funding on these payments for these types of drugs, the Act specifies that these funds can be paid by the minister out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund on any terms that the minister considers appropriate. So the Act references these payments for increased coverage of contraception and diabetes treatment drugs, and that they can come from this Consolidated Revenue Fund. It's basically like a piggy bank approach, which is super different than how things typically go. Also, let's keep in mind, it's not sure if this piggy bank is intended to be available for other drugs or if it's just intended to be used in these limited circumstances. In addition to the provisions on funding and payments, the Act also includes provisions relating to the development of the national formulary and the establishment of a national bulk purchasing strategy. So as a first step, the Act gives the minister the right to seek advice from our friends at the Canadian Drug Agency on a number of things, including clinical and cost effectiveness of prescription drugs, what drugs and related products should be included on the Canadian drug plans and the conditions of that coverage, information and recommendations that should be provided to healthcare professionals and patients about appropriate use, and overall ways to improve the pharmaceutical system. The Act then goes on to require that the minister make 2 requests of the Canadian Drug Agency. Both of these requests need to be prepared no later than 1 year after the day on which the Act receives royal assent. So the first item that the minister must request from the Canadian Drug Agency is a list of essential prescription drugs and related products. This is the list that's intended to inform the development of our national formulary. Once the agency delivers this list of essential drugs, the Act directs that the feds must initiate discussions with the provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples, and other partners and stakeholders based on that list, with the aim of continuing to work towards the implementation of national universal pharmacare. The second item that the minister must request from the Canadian Drug Agency is a national bulk purchasing strategy for prescription drugs to support the principles of the Act. We're going to come back to this at the roundtable. There's tons of uncertainty around what this call for a strategy even means and how it's going to work in practice. In addition, the Act requires the feds to publish a pan-Canadian strategy regarding the appropriate use of prescription drugs and related products. It also provides that the feds may request that the Canadian Drug Agency prepare progress reports every 3 years. And the act finally requires the feds to establish a committee of experts to make recommendations regarding options for the operation and financing of our national universal single-payer pharmacare. This committee has to be established within 30 days, and they must deliver a written report to the minister within the first year of the act coming into force. Interestingly, the act does not provide for any regulation-making power. So thank you for joining us in terms of what we hope was helpful and engaging and a fun morning session for you all.